Alright, welcome to Quadratic Inverses Level 1. Now, you'll notice in our very first example, I'm asking you to find the inverse function of y equals x minus 5, and all of that is, of course, being squared. I want you to start by writing PEMDAS going down the right-hand side. And what we're doing here is taking our order of operations, and we're going to draw an arrow going up to signify that whenever we do any type of algebra, well, we're always doing our order of operations in reverse. And essentially, anytime we do these operations in reverse, we're actually doing the inverse of these and the inverse of the entire order of operations. Now let's take a look at this. We know that we want to find f inverse of x, which always implies that we have to begin by taking our y and our x, and we know that we want to switch them. So I can actually rewrite this as x equals parentheses y minus 5, and of course the whole thing being squared. We'll notice a couple things. Inside this parentheses we have the y minus 5, so I want you to go over there and star the letter p, and I'm even going to put x minus 5 there so you understand that's what we're talking about. We also see this 2 and know that we have an exponent. Well, the reason I had to draw this arrow is to show that we're taking this order of operations in reverse. So the very first thing we want to get rid of is that exponent. And you have to ask yourself, well, what gets rid of a square? And of course, the answer is we want to take the square root. The square root is the inverse of the square, and it gets rid of them. And what we do to one side, well, we want to do to the other. Now, at this point, what's our next line going to look like? We have the square root of x equals y minus 5. Inherently, all we have to do to get y by itself now is get rid of this minus 5, and you ask yourself, what's the opposite of minus 5? Well, that would be plus 5. Now, the big question you're going to have is, does this plus 5 go inside the square root or outside? And because it's being added at the end, well, we're going to put it at the very end outside the square root. Notice how that stops right there, and the plus 5 is not being affected by it. Lastly, we're going to take this y, and instead of writing y, we want to write f inverse of x. And this, of course, will be our final answer. Okay, well here we have our second example, and you'll know that it's slightly more complex. So let's take a look and see what things we have. First, I notice that I have my x plus 2 inside the parentheses, so I'll star that, and I'll write that x plus 2, knowing that what's in the parentheses will be the last thing that I want to get rid of. I see that I have my exponent, my square, and I also see this minus 5 right there, so I'm going to go way down here, and let's kind of start our subtraction. Well, we're being asked to find, once again, f inverse of x. So what's our first step? We want to take our y and our x, and we want to switch them. So instead of y equals, let's go ahead and write x equals parentheses y plus 2 squared minus 5. Now, once again, whenever we're trying to solve anything algebraically, we're doing our order of operations in reverse, and I come down here and look and see that the very first thing I had starved is the s. So you ask yourself, what is the opposite of subtraction? And we know that the inverse operation would be to use addition. So we'll do plus 5, and what we do on the right, well, we have to do on the left. And we can go ahead and write this as x plus 5 equals parentheses y plus 2 squared. And you'll notice at this point, this is basically the problem that we had in example 1. Well, now I ask myself, how do I get rid of that exponent? And kind of like in the last problem, we know that the opposite of squaring something is to take the square root. Except in this case, we'll have to take the square root of everything on the left, including that plus 5. Now, once those cancel out, we have the square root of x plus 5 is equal to y plus 2. And to get rid of that parentheses, to get rid of the plus 2, we simply have to subtract 2, minus 2. Once again, where does that go? Well, I'm going to go ahead and take my y and write it here as f inverse of x equals, let's make that better x, equals the square root of x plus 5. And at the very end, outside of the square root, we'll put that minus 2. And that will be our example, or our answer, for example 2. Alright, in example 3, you'll notice it's a little bit different this time. Rather than having addition at the end, you'll notice I put this 8 right beside the parentheses. Well, ask yourself, when two things are side by side, what's happening? And we know that they're being multiplied. Now, we still have the same operations that we originally had. We have this x plus 5 inside the parentheses. So I'll go ahead and put that right up there by the p. And we still have that square, so we know how we have this e. And looking at this little mnemonic that I drew, what's our first step? What do we have to do first? Well, remember, we're finding the inverse. So we'll take our x and our y and flip them. So we have x equals 8 parentheses y plus 5 squared. And when you look at this, what's the first thing we have to get rid of? Well, going from the bottom up, we see we have to get rid of the multiplication. And you ask yourself, what is the opposite of multiplication? In this case, we want to divide both sides by 8. And this gives us the line x over 8 equals parentheses y plus 5 squared. How do we get rid of the exponent? Well, to get rid of that square, we know that we're going to take the square root, and what we do to the right, of course, we have to do to the left. And don't forget, get that entire fraction inside that square root. So those cancel, and at this point, we now have the square root of x over 8 equals y plus 5. And what is the opposite of plus 5? Once again, we finish by subtracting 5, and we'll rewrite our y as f inverse of x equals the square root of x over 8, and outside of that, minus 5 for our final answer. Here we have our fourth and final example. So when you look at example 4, and we want to find the inverse function of y equals negative 3 parentheses x minus 6 squared plus 8, it's going to be helpful to identify our operations that we have first. I see that we have this plus 8, so that falls under addition. I see we have this minus 3, and it's next to the parentheses. Remember, things that are side by side are being multiplied. We also have our x minus 6 in the parentheses. We know that we'll get rid of that last. And we have that little 2. Once again, we have our exponent. Now, when working through this, before we begin, we know that we have to start by switching our x and our y. So x equals negative 3 parentheses y minus 6 squared plus 8. And by the way, I see so many of y'all get hung up on this. You don't start the problem and you think that you don't know how to solve it. Just switch the x and the y first. It's such a huge key step. Now, looking at the operations that we've started, we know that working from the bottom up, the first thing we have to get rid of this a, or the addition. What is the opposite of plus 8? Well, minus 8. And minus 8 again. So when we write this next line, we write x minus 8 equals negative 3 parentheses y minus 6 squared. Looking back at our PEMDAS mnemonic, we know the next thing to get rid of is this multiplication. And kind of like in example 3, to get rid of that we have to divide by negative 3. Now I'm going to bring this down over here to the left, and at this point we have x minus 8 over negative 3 is equal to parentheses y minus 6 squared. And in order to get rid of this exponent, once again, what is the opposite of squaring something? Well, we'll take the square root. What I do to the right, I know I want to do to the left. I take the square root of the entire thing, and whenever I go to rewrite my second to last line, I know that it'll look like this. The square root of x minus 8 all over negative 3 equals y minus 6. Well, how do we get rid of the minus 6? What's the opposite? Plus 6, plus 6. And to finish this problem off, we know we change our y into f inverse of x equals square root x minus 8 over negative 3, and just squeezing this in, that plus 6. Notice that plus 6 is not inside the square root. Alright, thank you all, and I'll see you all in our next video.